Well, welcome to everyone on this earlier afternoon than we had originally anticipated. I'm glad you made it over despite the almost whiteout blizzard going on out there. And we're happy to have people joining us online as well. So this year we've been celebrating the 75th anniversary of the Medieval Institute here at Notre Dame. And we've had a number of events going on, including a series of alumni lectures. This is the second of, we had intended to have 4, one couldn't make it because of COVID. This will be the second, and then we'll have a third a little bit later on in the semester. And I'm delighted that so many people have come out for it, and to welcome one of our illustrious alumni back to the MI to talk about his research. And to introduce him, I will bring my colleague Martin Bloomer, fellow member of the Medieval Institute, fellow of the Medieval Institute, to introduce him. Thank you.
Thank you.
Professor Berman.
I'm glad to see you all. I think I see probably 3 faces that don't know Professor Irving. And so he wants me to be brief, and I'll use that as my excuse to be brief. You'll see that everybody is welcoming him. Jupiter Nevanes welcomes you in the customary mode. You know what this place is all about. Professor Irving appeared in South Bend, I believe, 20 years ago to pursue an MTS. I see other people who have taken the same course, and was snapped up by the Medieval Institute, where he wrote an innovative dissertation under the direction of the Emeritus Professor of Latin, Daniel Sheeran. Those of you who know Professor Sheeran, who wanted to be with us but could not today, will recognize certain characteristics in Professor Irving's work. An intense, precise, but lively encounter with texts. A comprehensive survey of the bibliographical and archival records. No matter what the language, no matter how difficult the librarian, they work their magic. And the hardest to describe, a sympathetic interpretation which attends to the social, historical, and religious milieu of the text production, but not just that, of its use and reuse. So yes, he's an expert on early Italian liturgical books, on Monte Cassino and Benevent script. But the question that some of you should be asking is, how did he get here? So I speak to the student. He got here by the broad training of the Medieval Institute and what it allows you to do. After that, his career was like one of those medieval poets, vagrans et insuriens. Except in his case, since it's a very fine book, he was vagrans et non insuriens, but it was vagrant. Lecturer in liturgics at Huron University, postdoc in sacred music at Yale, assistant professor at GTS in New York, and that culmination of a pre-career, 2 years of postdoc at the Cologne Center for E-Humanities, working on a project on the digital school book. And you can come back to hear more about that Monday at 4 p.m., where he will talk about that project. And now assistant professor at Groningen. He's not a theologian. He's not a historian. Maybe it's peculiarly Dutch, but it seems to me an excellent career for the medievalist. In that he's teaching and working on what they call religious heritage. And I think that's a wonderful place for a medievalist to be. But today, you want me to stop, don't you? Today you're only going to get one object.
Well, thank you very much. I feel, I must say, quite moved and honored to be here after 20 years, to come back to this place that was so important in my professionalization and in my personal life. So thank you very much. Approaching a manuscript library in order to consult a treasure manuscript can be a rather daunting experience. After the presentation of carefully crafted letters of introduction the diligent examination of a rather scratchy microfilm, not that long ago, and after days of patient and persistent inquiry with a curator who was teutonically implacable, one Friday morning I nervously waited in a specially reserved section of the manuscript reading room of the Bayerische Staatsbibliothek, 9 o'clock sharp. While a whole class of paleography students had been invited to witness this event. And as we watched, security guards and curators carefully and silently brought a large box containing the famed gospel book, the Uta Codex, and its treasure casket into the hushed room and placed it on the table. Cushions were laid out, gloves were put on, breaths were held as the unwieldy object was extracted, laid upon its bed, and exposed at the centre of our attention. The combination of solemn movement and display brought to mind at that time a remark of the Italian codicologist Ezio Ornato. Ornato had lamented the burial of sacred manuscripts in library strong rooms, where the corpse of the manuscript would suffer no disturbance in, quote, the serene but impenetrable silence of its tomb. The manuscript library was, he wrote, in danger of becoming turned into a cemetery, quote, visited by a sparse group of silent visitors, each supplied with gloves. My own view as a PhD student beholding the object before us that morning in Munich was, well, less negative. I could hardly stop squealing inside. But certainly I was struck by the silence in that encounter, by the semi-ritualized solemn movement with book and box, by the palpable impact of display. Despite having duly prepared myself, and despite being keenly aware of the reputation of the object as, quote, perhaps the most important work of Western Illumination of its day, in the encounter with the Codex, I was confronted by an unexpected question. What is this thing? And what does one do with it? These questions have haunted me, and I wish to use the following minutes to use them to reconsider the Uta Codex. The question, is the Uta Codex a liturgical book, will recur as a kind of agent provocateur to re-examine the object of our inquiry from a variety of angles. We'll proceed in 3 steps. After a necessary material description of the book and its box, and a note concerning the sites and occasions for which they were made, we will attempt to answer this question from the point of view of material, textual, and visual affordances, and both internal and external evidence of use. In conclusion, we will consider the implications for the study of liturgical books in general. The Uta Codex contains gospel pericopes gathered in gospel groups and preceded by full-page evangelist portraits and initial pages. It opens with a series of justly famous full-page illuminations and is concluded with a capitulary, providing the incipits of readings appointed throughout the liturgical year. The manuscript is composed of 119 folios of fine but sturdy parchment. The folio dimensions are moderately large, considerably larger, for instance, than that of the Gospels of Henry II, which shares both iconographic models and a scribal hand with the Uta Codex. But they're smaller than those of the famed Carolingian Codex Aureus of Sankt Emmeram, whose illuminations exerted considerable influence on the Uta Codex's ornament and iconography. The folios of the Uta Codex are gathered in 18 quires, of which the gatherings of 4 bifolia are the dominant form. The variation in quire lengths that does appear in the manuscript seems to have served 2 related purposes. On the one hand, it means that quire breaks are aligned with the conclusion and the beginning of each subsequent gospel group. And on the other, it facilitated the production of series of full-page illuminations on their own independent quires. Frank Bischoff has observed the systematic use of quires of irregular lengths in a high percentage of Gospel books, mostly of German origin, up to the 11th century. The practice both allowed the decorative program of deluxe manuscripts to be worked on separately from the text, and facilitated the selection of particular types or qualities of parchment for the high-density illuminations on individual folios or bifolia. With a proportion of width to height of just over 0.5, the written space is narrow in its proportions when compared with other long-line manuscripts. But this is a characteristic of Gospel books of this period, bestowing an impression of spaciousness on the page. The combination of relatively narrow written spaces and low numbers of well-spaced long lines for writing provided visual clarity that would facilitate reading during ritual performance. And it also provided generous margins which could be used to hold the pages open or flat without obscuring the text. The text itself is copied principally by a single scribe in Caroline minuscule of a large module. Hartmut Hoffmann described it as monumental. The combined effect of generously rounded forms with horizontal constraint at the rigorously maintained mid and base line lends a certain precisely calibrated energy to the script that is accentuated by the ascenders and descenders which lean to the right. The principal hand has been identified with that found in other known Sankt Emmeram products of the period. What of the binding? In May 1962, as part of the restoration of the Codex, the former soft parchment cover with which the manuscript had been bound since perhaps the 18th century was removed and sadly not preserved. It was replaced with modern wooden boards covered with greyish suede and these modern clasps. It has not been possible to determine how the book block was originally bound, though small wormholes both in the head and foot of the margin of folio 1 suggest, however it was bound, at some time insects and their larvae found there a happy home. It's possible that the volume was originally bound with double leaves of parchment, or perhaps softwood boards, covered with a precious textile, as we see in this, the 11th century Zeon Evangelistory, and the contemporary Monse Gospels, produced at Sankt Emmeram around the same time as the Uta Codex. The Codex did not need a sturdier binding, for it was kept in an equally famed book box, almost certainly also produced at Regensburg. The box is constructed of oak panels, riveted on all sides except its base, in highly worked gold and silver, and ornamented with enamels and precious stones. The cover of the box is adorned with a large enthroned Christ Pantocrator in gold repoussé work, whose head is surrounded by a finely wrought enamel nimbus, the heart-shaped patterning of which shows clear Byzantine influences. The figure raises his right hand in blessing, and in his left holds a book that bears the golden letters Alpha and Omega in finely wrought enamels. Already in 1953, Hermann Schnitzler argued convincingly that the golden filigree frames around the figure originally lay flat on the box. This construction would have maintained both a relatively simple compositional unity and rendered the high relief and dimensions of the central figure all the more imposing. In the mid-12th century, the filigree frames were raised about half a centimetre for reasons that are not clear. The alterations necessitated awkward adjustments around the nimbus and the superaneum under Christ's feet. The adjustment also explains why the panels of the box lid are deeper than those of the base, and why both were newly riveted with silver and gold panels ornamented with round coin-like stamp work that has recently been identified with Regensburg coin hoards datable to the mid-12th century, just over 100 years after the box was made. The four square medallions representing the there's the stamp work. The four square medallions representing the four evangelists were added possibly at this time. And in the course of the subsequent centuries, numerous enamels were also added, notably the 2 enamel medallions at the left and right of the frame, both of which antedate the production of the box and seem to have been produced outside Regensburg. The Uta box is thus a site of multiple interventions over a long period of time. At 2 places, the silver revetment has been damaged, which affords us a glimpse of the original textile covering on the exterior of the side panels. Red and yellow textile appears on the exterior of the lid, and a blue textile can be seen on the exterior of the base. In the interior of the box's cover and base, large amounts of an adhesive paste used to attach fabric remain on the flat boards and side panels, and these too show signs of textiles. The use of contrasting red and yellow and blue textiles in the Uta box must have created a striking effect, perhaps serving to recall or to announce the contrasting red and blue infill of the golden monogram initials with which each Gospel opens. The exterior of the base is presently completely unadorned and preserves no traces of adhesive or textiles. What seems to have escaped notice in scholarly literature is that fine round holes of regular dimensions are dotted across the baseboards. While it is difficult to discern any clear pattern in the holes in the centre of the base, it is possible to trace vertical lines of holes running down the left and right edges and horizontal lines at the head and foot. You might be able to, I hope, see them dotted across here. These may be evidence of traces of a lost metalwork plate affixed to the base, of the kind placed over precious textiles on a number of early 11th century gospel treasure bindings from southern Germany, like the Henry II Evangelistory. A curious feature of the current configuration of the box is that lid and base are joined, counterintuitively, on the right-hand side, opening that way, as it were, by modern hinges, perhaps to force a more attentive opening of the cover. It's not clear, however, how, or indeed whether, the 2 parts of the box were originally joined together at all. Intriguingly, on the right-hand side of the base's interior, 3 irregular chisel cuts have been made across the edge of the side panel. From 2 small holes at the centre of each of these cuts produce the severed ends of cords, the other ends of which can be seen directly below where the side panel joins the flat base of the box. These structures are difficult to interpret and date and function. Their irregularity and somewhat clumsy construction, together with the evidence of the original textile lining of the box, suggests that they do not date from the earliest production period, but were added sometime later, perhaps during the 12th century alterations to the lid. It seems to me that it's unlikely that they served in some way to bind the lid and base together, as one curator has recently suggested, for an internal hinge construction is highly unusual for caskets, and in this case the cords would seem perilously weak to bear the strain of the weight of the cover. The severed cord structures may have been intended instead to hold the contents of the box in some way, perhaps when the box was in movement or tilted for display. The fact that the Codex was produced by the scriptorium of Sankt Emmeram in Regensburg is undisputed. Scribal hands in the Uta Codex, as we have noted, been identified in other known products of Sankt Emmeram, and the illuminations, which appear to be the work of a single artist, clearly drew inspiration from the Codex Aureus of Sankt Emmeram, which you see here, in ornament, in use of colour, in framing devices, and in the use and adaptation of specific iconographic elements. The box's exceptional and to some extent unparalleled design, the box that is, combined with the relative rarity of book boxes in general, makes the identification of a shared technique or distinguishable workmanship that might associate the box with other works of Regensburg goldsmithing somewhat more difficult. Nevertheless, since at least the late 19th century, the box has been confidently attributed a Regensburg origin, a point confirmed by the addition of those stamp work embosses on the sides. The box and the book are an ensemble. that the manuscript was designed for use at the Abbey of Niedermünster, a brisk 15 minutes walk from Sankt Emmeram, can be deduced from 2 full-page illuminations at the beginning of the manuscript, and by references to feasts in the capitulary at its conclusion. The illumination of a bishop, labelled Sanctus Herhardus, and the appointment of a pericope for use in Natale Sancti Herhadi Episcopi in the capitulary, indicate the intended association between the Codex and the site of that saint's tomb and veneration, the Abbey of Niedermünster. The early 11th century fostering of the cult of Erhard owed much to Emperor Henry II's familial connection with Niedermünster, where both his mother, Gisela of Burgundy, and his grandparents, Duke Henry I and his spouse Judith, were buried. Henry and Judith were in part responsible for the refounding of the community of Niedermünster around 950, and for undertaking the construction of an entirely new triapsidal basilica and adjoining monastic complex, to which Judith herself retired in 973. By the middle of the 11th century, Erhard's tomb had been heavily reworked. Apparently, in order to afford visibility and access to the tomb, the Ottonian and Carolingian floor levels were pierced, a shaft was constructed connecting the tomb with the lid of the saintly bishop's sarcophagus, and this was repositioned just above the new basilica floor level. It seems likely that this transformation was completed prior to, and perhaps in preparation for, Erhard's canonization by Leo IX in the presence of none other than Henry III at Niedermünster in 1052. If Erhard was Niedermünster's saint, the Codex was clearly marked as Niedermünster's book. The occasion of the manuscript's production is indicated by the remarkable image of a female monastic labelled Lady Abbess Uta, drawn over the ornamented frame at the bottom left of the dedication image. The figure looks up towards the enthroned Virgin and Child at the centre of the image and offers a golden book, surely to be understood as the Codex itself, in her outstretched hands. Not only does the accompanying verse play on the homophony of the offering, the vota, and the offerer's name, Wota, but the visual rhyme between the depiction of the golden codex raised in Uta's hands and the codex in the viewer's hands makes the manuscript book itself and the offerer the object that the Virgin is asked to receive in the titulus. Both to receive at the time of its first offering, perhaps during the offertory at the Mass, as one scholar has argued, and now. The Codex constitutes thus both the vota which Uta, in an eternal present, continually offers to the Virgin, and the perpetual witness of this ongoing act. Only one abbess by this name is known to have been associated with the Regensburg Abbey in the late 10th and early 11th centuries. She is last attested in a charter of 1025, and Uta is recorded as deceased in 1044. The identification of this abbess with the female religious depicted in the full-length portrait of a figure named Wota in the so-called Bamberg rulebook, copied for Niedermünster around 990, entails both an early date for the beginning of Uta's tenure and associates her, and therefore the Codex and its box, with a monastic reform initiative undertaken in Regensburg by Bishop Wolfgang and Abbot Rambold of Sankt Emmeram, who you see here on the right, Abbot of Sankt Emmeram in the last quarter of the 10th century. The commission and donation of the Codex and its box in its original form has consequently been variously dated between around 1020 to around 1044, with some preference for a date around 1025 to 1030. So much for the material description. Attention to the occasion of the book's production and donation helps us to zoom out, as it were, in order to consider the objects as a whole, and thereby to return from a different perspective to the question, what is this thing? And what does one do with it? Or to put it another way, what is the relationship between the material aspects of these objects and plausible behaviours that they made possible or in some way shaped? The scholar of visual perception, James Gibson, coined the term affordances to describe what an environment affords the perceiving animal, what it offers, provides, or furnishes. Gibson argued that, quote, what we perceive when we look at objects are their affordances, not their qualities. That is, he argued, we see that what kinds of behaviours these objects afford. It's not simply that things, from door handles to a piece of chocolate, have a demand character, telling us what to do with them, grasp me, eat me. Rather, Gibson wrote, things are always perceived in an environment of which the perceivers themselves are part. What the object affords is accordingly dependent upon what it is materially, but at the same time, materiality is situated within an ecology. To cite Gibson's classic example, a post box with its characteristic attached closed form with a small opening and official insignia is recognised as an object that affords the mailing of letters and not a trash can or a birdhouse for a human being situated in an ecology of letter writing that has a postal system. Many of the most immediate perceptible affordances of the Uta Codex and its box assemblage are, of course, shared by other books and boxes. Nevertheless, I hope you will indulge me in describing them, for though they are seldom explicitly considered, it seems to me they are in some way fundamental, and slowing down to observe them may help us to understand this box and book a little bit better. A box with a hollow interior and at least one side that can be opened in some way affords, for example, the placement of one or more correspondingly portioned objects within it. A box thus allows fundamentally for the separation of the object from its surrounding environment for any number of reasons. For the keeping of its contents and store for future use, and for transportation. The fact that the box is detached, to use Gibson's term, that is, it's not affixed to a support or so heavy that it cannot be moved, affords transportation of the contents of the box without the need to handle or touch these contents directly during the movement. The use of opaque or solid materials in the box's construction affords concealment of the contents. Indeed, whether the box is filled at all remains a mystery. The box walls afford, therefore, an everyday mystery. At the same time, solid materials afford both protection from environmental damage and stability during transportation. A box's flat surfaces and non-malleable materials entail that it fits with other flat surfaces, or a shelf, a litter, an altar mensa, or perhaps a soft surface like a cushion, provided that the surface can take the weight. A codex, on the other hand, could be described as an object that offers a high concentration of durable writing surfaces in a compact transportable format. The binding of the codex in multiple layers and multiple gatherings of surfaces allows for the stable articulation of the object to reveal pages with minimal wear and damage, unlike a single quire codex. At the same time, articulated gatherings permit the book to remain open at a chosen position, with little need for material or human intervention to hold it in place. The parchment, which is light, durable, and flexible, affords a support for inscription in a high contrast colour that is relatively uniform, and this affords legibility to whatever is written or painted on its surface. In sum, we can say that the codex and its box afford the behaviours of storing, transporting, concealing, protecting, opening and closing with minimal damage and stress on the objects, and offer legibility and preservation of texts and images in combination with these activities. Yes, well, I can hear you. Can we be a little bit more specific, please? The depth of the box's exterior, perhaps. It measured originally around 80 millimeters. It's of a size that affords grasping by an adult hand. The dimensions of the box, its weight with or without its contents, and the presence of intricate gold filigree panels and protruding precious stones around its outer edges impose, however, constraints on manual grasping. Since it has no handle, the box would need to be carried by 2 hands and not 1, which in turn entails a certain deliberateness of action and movement for the box. In other words, the box's shape, size, weight, design, and materials influence and perhaps even determine how the behavior made possible by the fact that the box is detached can be plausibly executed. Of course, it is also possible that the box could be transported on a carrying device, such as a litter, minimizing direct contact by human hands during transport. Further, we can perceive the combination of the box's large surface area with a relatively narrow depth as a risk factor if the box was stored or displayed or transported in an upright position. And the presence of fragile repoussé work, filigree and precious stones on one side of the box clearly augments this risk factor. This in turn implies a constraint on the usual position for the storage, display and transportation of the box. Horizontal or close to horizontal, either on a flat or firm surface or a soft padded surface. Bearing this in mind is an important corrective for the student of the Codex, accustomed to viewing photographs of the box cover as though it were an image on an upright wall in print and digital media. The division of the box into 2 parts, base and cover, entails some means to hold the component parts together during transport and display. If the box was transported and displayed horizontally, there may be no need for anything other than gravity to hold the elements together. It's worth noting, however, that there's no sign of any lip added to the box interior to keep the cover in place. Affixed hinges, which we know were added to the box exterior in the modern period, and may have been present earlier, would keep the base and cover from parting company if the box was relatively horizontal. But if it was vertical, they wouldn't help much. And then you might need some other mechanism to hold the contents in place, like perhaps those cord structures. With respect to the Uta Codex itself, the large module of the script and the relatively low number of long lines in a narrow written space afford and facilitate the performance of public reading at a modest distance in unstable lighting, minimizing the need for significant pauses in performance. The relatively large size of the folios and their modest, broad proportions help the folios to fall flat under their own weight when the book is open. Recent scholarship has shown that smaller folios of narrow proportions tend to be employed for books intended to be held with one hand during instruction or singing. As we saw with the box, the size of the codex also implies handling with 2 hands, and thus a certain deliberateness of movement, and perhaps the use of a firm support when the book is open. The support would be all the more important if the codex originally had a soft parchment cover. The presence of reasonably wide side margins also affords room for a reader or an assistant manually to hold pages flat during performance without obscuring the text. The text, which presents 14 gospel pericopes assigned for use during the celebration of the Mass during the liturgical year, affords the use of the codex for the reading of the appointed gospel by a deacon or priest during celebrations of the Eucharist. The provision is limited. It does not provide the Mass pericopes for the ferial days of Lent, Easter, Ember Weeks, and Advent, nor for the periods after Epiphany and Pentecost. Furthermore, the provision of proper saints for saints' feasts is highly limited, though the pericopes appointed for the commons of apostles, martyrs, and virgins and confessors could be used for this purpose. Just one votive Mass is provided for, that for the Holy Cross, provided for Fridays. The pericopes are assigned to feasts in the capitulary that is copied in the last quire of the manuscript. You see the beginning here. There are a few discrepancies. 5 pericopes sequentially numbered in the body of the manuscript don't appear in the capitulary. And one pericope assigned in the pericope doesn't appear in the manuscript. The presence of liturgical gospel pericopes also affords that the manuscript could be used for the reading of the gospel at the conclusion of the night office, Vigiliae, for so-called 12-lection feasts, and thus not only for the Mass. The vast majority of the pericopes in the Codex are in fact dual purpose, equally affording reading at the conclusion of the night office and during the celebration of the Mass on Sundays and solemn feasts. According to the rule of Benedict, the night office for Sundays and solemn feasts was to be concluded by the abbot's intoning of the Te Deum Laudamus and by his reading of the Gospel, quote, while all the monks stand in respect and awe. After which the antiphon Te Decet Laus was intoned in a concluding collect recited by the abbot. A late 10th century Sankt Emmeram customary provides a fuller account of this ritual. After the intoning of the Te Deum, the abbot and his attendants proceeded directly to the sacristy, where vestments for the servers, holy water, comb, very important, gospel book, missal and thurible, and candles had all been laid out in preparation. The phrase per singulos dies in the Te Deum served as a cue to the party to re-enter the church in solemn procession. They proceeded to a lectern which had been set in place by the sacristan, who held a lantern for the abbot's reading. The customary specifies that the gospel book from which the abbot read is carried by the abbot himself during the entrance and retiring procession. Unfortunately, a contemporary customary from Niedermünster, the women's community, is lacking. However, the copy of the Rule of Benedict and the so-called Bamberg Rulebook, which includes, as we have noted, an encomiastic poem of Abbess Uta, makes explicit that the solemn reading of the Gospel at the conclusion of the night office on 12-lection feasts was not restricted to male abbots or their male deputies. Here, the female forms are the norm, and the male interlinear additions, inserted after the manuscript's later transfer to the male monastery of St. Michael in Bamberg. This has escaped scholarly attention so far. We may then, with some confidence, state that if the Uta Codex was indeed used for night office readings on Sundays and 12-lection feasts, Abbess Uta herself would have read from this her codex. The use of the pericopes in liturgical performances, Mass or night office, is facilitated by two features that help the user of the codex to locate the assigned pericope. Most evangelisteries order the pericopes according to the liturgical year, either with distinct or with integrated temporal and sanctoral cycles, each pericope being introduced by a rubric that serves as a kind of title, specifying the occasion for which the pericope is to be used. The Uta Codex, exceptionally, groups the liturgical pericopes not according to the liturgical cycle, but according to the Gospels from which they're excerpted. There are thus 4 Gospel pericope groupings in the Codex: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, each introduced by a sequence of 3 full-page illuminations, evangelist portrait, full-page initial, and interlude page. In addition to their ornamental and iconographic significance, this series of full-page illuminations affords the book user orientation within the volume, dividing the liturgical pericopes clearly into their gospel groups. A second and more precise aid is provided by a numbering system. The Gospel pericopes are sequentially numbered with golden Roman numerals within each Gospel group. At the back of the Codex, the capitulary refers the user to the Gospel group to which the appointed pericope belongs, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, and provides a Roman numeral that identifies where in that group the reading can be found. A handful of uncorrected errors notwithstanding, the system is elegantly simple and efficient. It's also absolutely necessary. For the order of the pericopes within the Gospel groupings is less than immediately obvious. Despite the appearance of a regular order of evangelist portraits coupled with the opening pericopes from the first chapters of Matthew, Luke, and John, in each of these Gospels, it becomes quickly apparent that the Codex does not follow the order of the biblical text within the Gospel groupings. To cite just one example, the account of the Nativity in Pericope 2 in the Matthew group is followed immediately by the adult Christ's harsh address to the scribes and Pharisees 23 biblical chapters later in Pericope 3. Non-consecutive biblical pericopes are copied without assigning rubrics and without even a line break to divide them. They appear absolutely continuous. The fundamental rationale underlying the order of the pericopes within each Gospel book group has hitherto been understudied. It appears to me to be liturgical at base. A cycle can be discerned in each Gospel group, excepting Mark, running from Christmas to the octave of Pentecost and followed by a limited Sanctorale, then the Sundays after Pentecost, and then the Commons. This basic liturgical ordering is, however, obscured, and not only by a lack of rubrics. First, by a framing device that seems to be theologically motivated. In Matthew, Luke, and John, the order begins, naturally enough, with pericopes concerning the genealogy, nativity, and incarnation, appointed for the Christmas feast. The group of pericopes from Mark, of course, lack that reading, no infancy narrative, so it opens instead with a pericope appointed for Easter Sunday, the resurrection narrative, followed immediately by that appointed for the Ascension, and then other pericopes from Mark. However, despite the fact that the Easter resurrection accounts from all four Gospels are provided, all four Gospel groupings do not conclude with this. They conclude instead with the Passion narrative, appointed for Holy Week. Secondly, for reasons that are yet to be determined, the liturgical order that I can discern in the pericopes is occasionally interrupted by groups of readings whose sequence aligns neither with the biblical narrative order nor with the liturgical order. The manner in which the incipits are handled, both in the capitulary and in the body of the text, is surprisingly complex and worth spending a moment to unpick, if you'll bear with me. The opening of the biblical pericope often requires some sort of adjustment when used in liturgical celebration in order to indicate to the readers, the listeners, the subject of the sentence, who's speaking to whom, and the circumstance of the action and the discourse. Similarly, words, phrases, or references that are employed in the biblical texts are often in liturgical recitation omitted because they're not needed or don't make any sense. Tunc, et, autem, ergo are all omitted in the liturgical performance. How is this handled in the Uta Codex? The fact that the phrase in illo tempore was employed before nearly all Gospel pericopes at that time explains why it's not copied again and again and again in the list of incipits in the capitulary. It's not needed. The liturgical phrase dixit Jesus discipuli suis, Jesus said to his disciples, and its variants. This phrase is, however, provided in nearly all of the capitulary incipits that open with direct speech. The capitulary's incipits also omit conjunctive adverbs, and they make explicit the subjects, objects, and actions understood from the context of the biblical text. In this way, the capitulary affords and facilitates preparation for liturgical celebration and reading. In addition, within the codex, where the texts are, the unrubricated incipits of the pericopes are occasionally adjusted just a little by liturgical additions, thereby facilitating liturgical reading. Here's the two examples of in illo tempore. Subjects, objects, and contexts implied by the biblical text, but not expressed in the opening verse of the biblical text, are also routinely supplied in the incipits of the pericope in the body of the codex. They're filled in. While around a third of the pericopes present an unaltered biblical incipit against the incipit given in the capitulary, roughly the same proportion of pericopes employ an opening that matches exactly what is given in the pericope against the biblical text. Curiously, in another 23 instances, while the incipit of the pericope given in the body of the manuscript closely aligns with that in the capitulary, it diverges from it in some way, and not to agree with the biblical text. Occasionally, the discrepancy results from a melding of Vulgate and capitulary incipits. More frequently, however, the pericope's opening includes a word or phrasing that occurs neither in the capitulary nor in the biblical text. This occurs most frequently when the pericope opens with direct speech. In place of the verb dixit, employed in the standard phrase dixit Jesus discipulis suis, employed in the capitulary, the pericope incipits in the text body show a marked preference for the synonymous verb ait, et ait Jesus discipulis suis, against both capitulary and the biblical text. In one instance, the pericope's incipit diverges from both biblical text and capitulary almost in its entirety. For the fourth Sunday after Epiphany, the capitulary appoints a passage from Matthew 8, providing the incipit cum descendisset Jesus de monte, an opening that differs from the biblical text only by the customary omission of the conjunctive autem. The text of the same pericope, in the body of the text, number 35 in the Matthew grouping, uses in contrast cum consumassit Jesus verba heic descendit de monte. The connection that the phrase verba heic appears to make between the present pericope and the speech of Jesus which precedes this pericope on the same page is utterly deceptive. What precedes are indeed the words of Jesus, but they were not uttered on any mount in Matthew 8, but in the city of Jerusalem in Matthew 23. The abrupt, non-chronological transition on a single page from the moment when Jesus addresses the crowds regarding the scribes and Pharisees, shortly before his arrest, trial, and crucifixion, to the immediate aftermath of the Sermon on the Mount at the beginning of his ministry, is artfully concealed. Further, despite the fact that conjunctions such as et, or the adverbs autem or tunc, are routinely omitted at the beginning of the reading during any actual liturgical performance, in the body of the Codex we find different approaches to their treatment. Sometimes they're omitted in accordance with the capitulary incipits, but on numerous occasions they're actually inserted when they don't appear in the biblical text. And they're supplied with a golden initial, even when... Oh, sorry, I got behind that. So there's my point. These verbs are not the words to which we're referring. And here we have the insertion of an et that appears neither in the capitulary nor the biblical text. So the question may be asked, what all the surprising and, I grant you, complicated reworking of incipits means. One aspect of this question concerns the scribal activity itself and asks who made the decision to vary the incipit formulas, and to what extent was a model followed somewhere. I wish to focus here, however, on the deliberate effort to produce a book that is not what it seems, or rather, seems to be what it is not. The division and organization of the Codex into 4 sections for the 4 Gospels, each introduced by full-page evangelist portraits of initial pages and incipit pages, and the provision of a capitulary, constitute the material and visual language not of an evangelistary, a book of liturgical pericopes, but of an evangeliary, a copy of the full 4 Gospels. Careful attention to the treatment of the pericope incipits reveals the completeness with which this appearance was constructed. Not only were the telltale signs of the evangelistary, such as the presence of rubrics, avoided, but line breaks were omitted between the pericopes, and most remarkable of all, conjunctive phrasing was actually inserted to artificially visually connect pericopes that are textually and liturgically distinct. These added phrases, though copied, were in fact never intended to be read at all, aloud, but in an almost Baroque conceit served to construct visually a unified evangelary text. Why this appearance of unity was so artfully constructed can only be speculated. It may constitute a display of artistic ability, scribal innovation, or a patron's fancy. It's also possible that the visual language of an evangeli enabled the book object to do something. Something that is, it afforded an action that would be more difficult to be performed with a kind of evangelistery that, unlike the Uta Codex, looked like what it was. The Codex is not the only part of the assemblage that appears to be something that it is not. The visual language of the Uta box is also, I would argue, at least ambiguous. The imposing proportions of that Christ figure, which exceed the framing filigree panels at head and foot, and find no parallel in surviving book boxes and treasure bindings up to and including the 11th century. The sheer dominance of the metalwork figure, framed with filigree and jewels, calls to mind less a luxury book cover than a Byzantine repoussé icon of the 10th and 11th century. While such icons appear to have been rare outside Byzantium in the 11th century, and it must be admitted that none is known of to survive that is associated with early 11th century Bavaria, it is certainly clear that the goldsmithing, heavily sponsored by Henry II and his spouse Kunigunda, drew direct inspiration and materials from Constantinopolitan metalwork products. Bisera Pancheva has recently argued that mixed media Byzantine icons, employing gold, repoussé, enamel and filigree to display the cult figure, should be understood as a theological move to understand and justify the icon as an imprint of the divine character that produced as a typos, a bas relief, which solidified, as it were, quote, the shape of an absence. This reworking of an ancient association between visual relics and imprinting thus elevated metalwork icons by the implication that they both represented the holy figure and, like contact relics, also bore the imprint of the divine. The gold repoussé work on the lid of the Uta box, clearly visible above the frame even when the box is lying flat, almost sculptural in its dimensions and depth, may be understood then not only as a technical accomplishment or a luxury product, but as a visual strategy associated with icons and reliquaries employed to invoke divine presence in whatever the box contained. When I informed the curator of the State Library in Munich that I needed to see the physical Uta Codex because I was looking for traces of use, I received the reply, "Aber Herr Irving, it is quite clear that the box was never used." It is certainly true that physical traces of use are meagre at best. The layers of alteration of the box lid provide evidence of the box's ongoing use of some kind, as does the damage caused to the forehead and nose and the removal of the silk interior lining. But it's difficult to determine the occasion of this wear and tear or the maintenance. With respect to the codex itself, the fact that omissions and errors have not been corrected is puzzling. And even minor alterations, though not entirely absent, are very rare and appear to have been made near the production period. Carl Georg Pfändtner noted some water spotting and a few wax spots at the foot of one folio, and opined that the latter may derive from candles used during the liturgical celebration. Since the text on the page in question is the earlier part of the Matthew Passion, during which the candles were not borne, the damage is unlikely to have occurred during a liturgical reading of this folio, but perhaps on some other occasion. The parchment at the corners of the folios is not absolutely pristine, and a few folios show notable signs of dirt. But pinpointing the occasion of use implied by damage and dirt is not a simple matter. These few signs of repeated touch do not necessarily indicate handling during liturgical celebration itself. Moreover, while the relative lack of signs of wear and tear may indicate a lack of use, they may also indicate a particularly careful kind of use, constrained by the value and sanctity of highly praised objects. The late 10th century customary of Sankt Emmeram includes the admonition that when there are 12 lection feasts, the sacristan is to ensure that there is water in the sacristy, Quote, "For he should not uncover or cover the altar or handle sacred vessels, so much less the sacred gospel book, with unwashed hands." Clean pages may simply indicate clean hands. To complement the rather meagre material traces of use on the objects themselves, we may turn to external written evidence of contemporary monastic custom. We've already noted the description of the abbess's solemn reading of the gospel at the conclusion of the night office on certain feasts. In addition to routine accounts of the manner of the reading of the gospel during Mass, the Sankt Emmeram customary includes a few brief remarks concerning the use of the gospel in exceptional circumstances. The most extensive prescriptions appear in the provisions for the procession on Palm Sunday, and they provide a particularly rich picture of gospel book use in Regensburg at this time, with which we will conclude. No, I will not translate all of that, I'm going to summarize. Before prime, the sacristans were to prepare a certain bier or litter, on which were laid small reliquaries on the gospel book. The litter was to be secretly transported, together with crosses, candles, holy water, thurible, gospel book, and cloths, flowers, palms, and etc., to the church from which the palm procession was to be made. After the morning mass in the monastery, the abbot and community were to proceed in an orderly manner to the appointed church, where they would sing terce. After the reading of the palm gospel and blessing and distribution of the palm branches and flowers, the procession set off. Quote, "Holy water first, the crosses, thuribles, candles, gospel book, and bier, borne by the abbot and presbyter with the utmost dignity." The use of two gospel books is implied. One is laid with the reliquaries on the litter that will be borne by the abbot and presbyter, and a second is to be taken with the other liturgical utensils actually needed for the rite: holy water, thuribles, candles, copes, cloths, branches, and flowers, to the church from which the procession sets out. At the entrance to the church, the procession divides into two. The altar party, presbyter, deacon, and subdeacon, remains at the west entrance with what they need for the Mass: thurible, candles, and gospel book. They only enter once the introit has begun. The monastic community, however, goes ahead, following the litter borne by abbot and presbyter directly into the church. The gospel book borne on that litter is then deposited on the altar, where the customary states it is to remain until Vespers. On Palm Sunday at Sankt Emmeram, the gospel book borne on the litter is used, but not for reading. The lack of contemporary description of the nuns' custom at Niedermünster means that we cannot be certain whether they performed a similar procession there. Nevertheless, this contemporary local source does provide insight into what we might term the performative possibilities of the Uta Codex and its box, one surely known to the sisters of Niedermünster. The decision of the creators of the Codex and of its box to make it seem to be what it is not, an evangeliary containing all the four Gospels, a metalwork icon or a reliquary, accord with a performance practice in which the entrance of the litter is celebrated in song and gesture as the entrance of Christ himself into Jerusalem. Use did not require the lid of the box to be opened at all. All was solemn movement and display. Conclusion. Patient attention to what activities and behaviours the book affords, materially, textually, and visually, without preemptively deciding whether these actions were actually carried out, helps us, it turns out, to resituate the Codex and its box in a performative context. We've noted how the size of objects, the legibility of script, the way in which they open and close, their textual contents, their organisation, the provision of finding aids, have implications and constraints in use. And had we had time, we might have also had occasion to consider the images which serve to render the Codex an ongoing offering, and, I would argue, to interpret liturgical feasts. Examination of physical evidence of the object's use and contemporary local prescriptions regarding the use of similar objects has helped us, in a limited way, to proceed from affordances to historical practice. Along the way, we found that affordance should be not only understood as including physical, material, or technological qualities, but may also include subtle strategies by means of which form, representation, layout, organization, and textual alteration conspire to make the assemblage look like something it isn't, in order that it may serve a particular purpose. But is this behavior liturgical? Consideration of the interplay between objects and possible or historical actions can help us to re-examine what exactly we mean when we use the apparently innocent term liturgical book. Are we referring to liturgical affordances or to practices? And what evidence do we draw on for the latter? Are we taking into account not only affordances but also liturgical constraints? That is, whether material, textual, visual, or other elements of the book limit possible liturgical uses or performances. When we refer to a book as liturgical or non-liturgical, are we referring to its constraints, whether it is large enough and of a quality that could imply that it could be used during liturgical performance, its affordances, whether it contains a text or texts that could potentially be used in liturgical performance or in the preparation for a liturgical performance, its intended function, whether or not it was designed to prepare for or be used in or to accompany or to refer to or to record information about the liturgy, or the history of its actual use, whether it was used in or was at the center of ritual activity during or in connection with liturgical celebration. What do we mean? While the material evidence of actual use of the Codex and its book is limited, and the textual evidence of local liturgical practices with like objects can only be used tentatively to reconstruct the Niedermünster practice, it is clear that in myriad ways the objects afford by design a large number of liturgical practices, including, but certainly not limited, to reading. The French art historian Jérôme Bachet has proposed the use of the term image-objet to underline that an image, quote, cannot be separated from the materiality of its support, nor from its existence as an object, acted upon and acting in specific places and situations, and implicated in the dynamics of social relations and in its relation to the supernatural world. Whatever the term liturgical book might be taken to mean, perhaps we can speak of the Uta Codex as a text objet. In that sense, perhaps my first introduction all those years ago to the Uta Codex at the Bayerische Staatsbibliothek could not have been better staged. Thank you.